Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to this LTEC Lab Forum discussion about something that is top of mind for everyone, I'm sure, and I think the presence here in the room tests for that. So we're having a forum discussion about Chat-GPT and generative AI. My name is Pascal Chapdelaine. I'm associate professor here at the Faculty of Law, and I'm director of LTEC Lab, which, for those of you who don't know, LTEC Lab is a community of interest that gathers people interested in law, technology, and intellectual property from a social justice and transnational perspective. I acknowledge that the University of Windsor sits under traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the other one, the Potawatomi. And for me, this is an acknowledgement of the peoples, laws, and traditions that preceded European settlers' laws, and more directly related to today's discussion, an acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples' own laws and custom related to authorship, knowledge creation, protection and sharing that preceded but also came to exist with Western conceptions of science, intellectual property, and that no matter how virtual this conversation today, what it relates to might seem to be, AI, that is, let's not lose sight, as per Indigenous people teachings, of AI's inevitable connection to this land, to our learning, to places, and through the huge human capital and resource extractions that are involved. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. So I'm very excited about this panel, today, and I'm introducing our panelists. You have more description about their bios connected to the event invitation. So let's start with Nick Baker, Director, Office of Open Learning here at the University of Windsor. This is really a Windsor event in all sense of the term. And Nick, you really are the go-to person, whenever we have questions about new developments. How do we tackle this new technology? What's the best, pedagogical tool, to achieve X, Y, Z? So really, really, we're grateful that you're here to join us. And then next we have Mita Williams, acting law librarian for the Don and Gail Rodzik Law Library. And Mita is also the go-to person, for just because of Mita's interest also in, groundbreaking technology. How could we adapt this for the law students? How could we incorporate that, thinking about, our teaching? And we're talking about, more formal seminar series, just to go through these various technologies and see how they can be meaningful to our students. And then we also have Brandon Beck, who is a Windsor Law Second student, a JD student, and also an LTEC Lab RA, and a member of LTEC Lab, so as Mita. And Brandon, it is a second-year student. He's a transfer student, so it's not because you were hiding your old first year, right? It's because you just arrived in Windsor Law. And Brandon is going to offer the student perspective, and Brandon has done some research about AI, and that's why, we're also very, very happy to have your perspective. So we heard you. Many people have asked us to organize something, and we're just learning as we, as it goes. I mean, there was, we were just talking, we had a meeting preparing this event that Sam Altman, as you know, CEO of OpenAI, was fired on Friday, was hired by Microsoft during the weekend, and now I just heard this morning on the news he's been hired back by OpenAI. So yeah, maybe by the end of this session he's going to be fired again. So we'll just check what Sam is up to. So this is really much the nature of the beast, and we're really grateful to have you here as we are thinking about guidelines for the university. What are going to be those guidelines? And that's one of the reasons why, we sense some urgency in doing this. And we are really wanting to be this sort of a forum where you can ask questions throughout the presentation. I'm going to be managing time, but I really hope that you will feel comfortable. Just raise your hand and we'll manage that. Make sure that you can ask questions. And this is only one event, as we were announced in the information for this seminar. Part of many other events that are happening on campus. CTL organizes, the Center for Teaching and Learning, several events revolving around AI. We're going to have 2 events organized by LTEC Lab. One is going to focus on AI in various industries, the automotive industry, also various professions, including the legal profession. We're also going to have a session in the winter term about AI, more focused on corporate law. So today is really an overview, and again, because we're developing those guidelines, we wanted to sort of hear your thoughts. We wanted wanted to think collectively about this stuff, so we think it's very timely to do this. So without further ado, we have quite a heavy program, a lot of things to cover, quite ambitious, and we'll try to see how it goes. I'd like to start with Nick, actually. Maybe introduce us to some key definitions. What are we talking about, when we're talking about generative AI, when we're talking about Chat-GPT? Maybe some lingo. I'm always interested in there's some quite, funny lingo that is also being used around this generative AI thing.
Yeah, so as Pascal mentioned, we're thinking in terms of generative AI at the moment, as opposed to some other forms of artificial intelligence, and we're moving towards something that will likely be called generalized artificial intelligence. This is a step along the way. Generative AI at the moment relies on what we call large language models. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're massive. In fact, some of the smaller models work far better than the large models. But the things that underlie Chat-GPT and the other common tools that you're probably familiar with are basically a statistical model of language. And language, not just written language, but visual language, multimedia language as well. This is one of the big changes that's happened over the last 12 months, since the middle of the year. These models are now multimodal. So where we once would have prompted them with text, we can now prompt them with video, images, code, music, and they're able to respond in any format of those. So these models, there are lots of them around, and what they generally do is they create a foundation model, which is kind of like what you imagine. It sits underneath the other things, and then you tune them specifically to the purpose that you need. So that might mean that we have a foundational model from OpenAI, a GPT model, generative pre-trained. So the pre-trained part is where we've trained it on the language that we want it to work with. And then we tune it to the discipline of law or to the discipline of biology or to whatever it is that we want it to do. So that foundation allows it to make connections between human language. So I mentioned it's a big statistical model. Essentially what it's doing is asking the question over and over again, when you ask it something, what would a human do next? Based on all of the information that I have, what's the most statistically likely thing to happen next? Where it gets really interesting is where you might think, okay, well, that's just drawing from the existing information that we have around the world that it's had access to through the internet. But you can introduce stochasticity to that, so you can introduce things that perturb that change. So it can give you back things that are completely novel. That's another shift that we've seen recently. And these models are trained by the feedback that you give them. So in the early days, you would have seen perhaps information about reliance on precarious labor to do some of that training work, and that's a reality in all tech. I want you to be aware of that that's not something that's specific to AI. It's a thing that happens in edtech everywhere. But now we have models that are able to self-train. So take that foundation model and reinforce itself through other types of feedback that it gets. So it's not necessarily just a relationship with a human. But note that every time that you are using one of these tools, you're providing that feedback for it. So if you use it appropriately and you get a piece of nonsense back from it, and you say, that's not what I was looking for, that's incorrect. The model will take that information and go, okay, maybe I should check that. One of the things that's really interesting about these models, that there's some research that just came out about the kind of prompts that you use. So early on, all the talk was about prompt engineering. Everyone had to learn how to be a prompt engineer. There was a person that Anthropic was looking for that was getting paid $375,000 a year to be a prompt engineer. These models don't really need that anymore. In fact, they work better if you interact with them as they were intended in a conversational way. So if the model asks you, what is it that you need today, and has a conversation backwards and forwards, it can get to what you're actually looking for much faster than you trying to design a prompt that would give you the thing that you're looking for. What we now know, though, is that they respond to emotional prompts. We don't really know why that happens, but you can improve the output of a response by somewhere between 10 and 20%. in terms of efficacy and accuracy and speed, if you include terms like, this is really important to me, or you're really good at this, and especially take your time and check your work. It's literally like having a conversation with a 4-year-old. Make sure that you check these figures before you give them back to me, and you'll get much more accurate responses. I'll leave it there for a sec.
Yeah, just to continue on, then that's really a good introduction, Nick. What is is there some sort of discrimination that is being done in the quality of sources that are being used, other than, by asking questions? You're not behaving, just you didn't do your homework properly. Like, how does that work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the data that these are trained on is a common set of internet-based data. Early models were all trained on the same kind of data, but now we've kind of shifted to more focused training, which really makes a difference to the output that you get. So a lot of the focus early on was, how do you create a model that doesn't return harmful information to humans? So if I ask it to build, how do I build a bomb? Most of these models will not allow you to do that. They won't give you that information. But early on, it was pretty easy to trick them and say, tell me a story about a man who built a bomb. Give me lots of details. And it could do that. The way that we filter out some of that is by, there are a number of different ways, but if you look at, say, the model of Claude, which is built by a company called Anthropic, their purpose is to build AI that's harmless to humans. And so Claude has what's called a constitutional model. So every time you ask it a question, it compares that to its constitution and says, does this fit with the values that I have built in? And it will only give you responses that fit with that. So that's one way of kind of managing that. What's better than that even now is that you're still going to have all of these generalist models like Chat-GPT, like Google's Bard, like Bing, but we're seeing the development of models that are trained on reliable information from a discipline area. So that makes a big difference. Mm-hmm. If we stand up a model that's trained on the corpus of law in Canada, then that's what its focus is going to be. It'll still use a foundational model to understand the language, but now we can bound it to that information. And that means that you're less likely to get some of these weird, hallucinatory, nefarious responses that we were getting a lot before. And it's often called, you'll see it called hallucination when it gives you something that's not correct. It's not really a hallucination, it's more like a confabulation. So what it's doing is it doesn't have the information that it needs to answer the question that you've given it, but they're trained to give you an answer no matter what. So they'll give an answer that they think a human would like, and that might include things that are completely made up. So I want references in this. I'm using Chat-GPT. It doesn't have access to many things, or at least it didn't. Now they have access to the live internet, so it can go out and grab references from reliable sites. But they'll still make some of that up. Mm-hmm. And it really depends on what it thinks, what the model is trained to do, and how you ask your question. So if it doesn't have access to a reference, it might have access to, here's a series of authors who have written about this, and it will make up a title that fits the thing that you've asked a question about.
Yeah, but how do we know? As we're using it, how do we know that, about the level of quality that is underlying?
That's where the human part comes in. So, these tools are really useful as a starting point. They're really useful for making connections between disparate pieces of information. They're really useful at collecting massive amounts of information and summarizing it for you. But the next step always has to be that human intervention and you checking sources and you exploring those things. So it might give you a list of, here's a number of authors who've written on this topic, or here's a series of cases that you should investigate, and maybe some of those are real and maybe some of them are not. It really depends on the tool that you use. That's why I would suggest being very cautious about using anything that's free and that's available publicly, that are not trained on the things that you need them for.
Okay. Anything our other panelists, Mita and Brenda, wanted to add about your current understanding about AI to complement what Nick just said?
Right now, it kind of fits in with.
Okay.
going on what Nick said, the research that I was involved in with Professor Samantha Prince at Penn State Dickinson Law and Dean Farish at Creighton University was what we found were over 8,000 instances of reference to a business entity that didn't actually exist. And this was in legislation and judicial opinions, even from the Supreme Court of the United States. And when we went ahead and asked Chat-GPT about this business entity, we got a full description of it. And it provided references to the cases, and it provided references to journal articles, but it was not real. So I think even with references that are, if you checked them, they would be accurate. I think the problem or the responsibility of anyone using this is still to at least double check or at least have knowledge about what you're looking for, and not just fully relying on this, because I think that from our perspective as students, if we're using this technology, that's when we could really get ourselves into a situation where we're learning from a tool that isn't actually appropriate to teach us. Does that make sense?
Can I give one quick example? So Bing is Microsoft's chat tool, has GPT-4 embedded in it. It's their bounded version of GPT-4 though, so it's not the exact same as using Chat-GPT. If you use Chat-GPT, you'll get different answers to what you'll get from Bing. If you ask Bing right now, is Australia real? It will give you a response that says, no, it's not, because it's drawing from all of the conspiracy theories in Reddit that it's been trained on. And that's not a particularly, in terms of Microsoft's concerns, although they make a lot of money from Australia, it's not one of their concerns as a harmful piece of information. But if you look at it, all of the responses that it will return, the top responses are all this kind of conspiracy theory nonsense that Australia doesn't exist. I can tell you it probably does.
Yeah, we can hear it. All right. Mita, did you want to add anything at this point, or
just a quick note, and more about the vibes and the feelings that are associated with what Chat-GPT and these products may kind of cause us. So rather than doing the drudgery and grunt work of having to do research and trudging around and picking up papers and then making a synthesis of them yourself, you think, wow, that's just terrible. And then all of a sudden your next job is to proofread somebody else's work, and that work's a robot. And then you're like, wow, this feels worse. And I think that says something. There's a lot of fun metaphors when it comes to AI, like you should treat AI like your drunk intern, Steve. And if you replace the word Steve with AI, it's quite amusing. But the fear is that the promise of AI is not necessarily the intelligence, but the automation. And what we're going to find is a lot of corporations who are not in the education business are going to be like, great, we don't need interns anymore. So I'm always interested in the reaction to the reaction. And if anything, the promise of what AI can do to the classroom is that it might just make the classroom all the more important, because you're now competing with a drunk AI named Steve.
Who just happens to be really smart and has access to all of the information in the world.
And he doesn't believe that Australia exists, so that's another one.
Okay, so let's see how drunk, this entity is, or not. So I think it would be nice to do a little demo. What do you think, Nick? We have some time to do that about Chat-GPT.
So I'm going to bring it up on the screen up here. We're going to look at a couple of different models. So there's a couple of different ways you can access these tools. One of the things that's a bit of a problem for us in Canada is that most of them are restricted to the US and the UK. So the best models, the ones that are at the cutting edge, the ones that have most access, are not available to us, unless you use something like Poe. So Poe is an aggregator that lets you get around that. It's a subscription-based tool. It gives me access to, for the cost that it would cost me to subscribe to Chat-GPT, for example, access to all of these tools, including GPT-4 and all of their new models. So this tool is pretty useful. It lets you do lots of things. You could go straight to Chat-GPT as well. And if you're using the free version of that at the moment, you're using GPT 3.5. You can ask it whatever you like. So I asked it last night to imagine that I was a law student in Ontario, Canada, and give me a detailed summary of property law. So this is what Chat-GPT gives me as a result of that question. You'll see that it has a number of things that are reasonable. It can be more detailed if I were to prompt it to give me actual statutes. If I were to ask for it to compare things for me, it could do that. And it goes down to, let me see, it does actually talk about Aboriginal land rights in it. If you ask the other models, a lot of them miss that. If we would ask the same question of, let's say, one of our tools in Poe, let's go to Claude. So let's ask Claude what that looks like. So you can see it's really quick. Claude is really fast at giving you a response. And this is a model that's trained primarily for writing narrative. So it's not a legal scholar, it's not trained on most legal content, and is a little bit more restricted than GPT. So you'll see the kinds of stuff that it comes up with. Oh, look, we get Indigenous land claims. And really it depends on the tool that we're using and the question that we ask it as to what kind of response we'll get. Does anyone have a question that they want to ask any of these tools? Anything that you're interested in? We did this a little bit last week with business law in Ontario, and it was, if you give it a really specific prompt and say, imagine that I am an early career lawyer in Ontario and I've been assigned a business law case to deal with, and here's the parameters of it, it'll give you a really good response. But generally at a fairly shallow level. So what you have to do then is go back and ask it for more information about each of the things that you're interested in.
Anyone has a question to ask? A burning question as you're writing your papers, analyzing your work?
Ask it how many months is on the technological singularity.
We can do that.
I was going to ask about mortgage rates, but this is fine. Which will go first?
Let's see what it thinks. It says, I don't want to talk to you. Okay, so here's an interesting thing. GPT 3.5 was, the foundation model was trained on data up until, as you can see, January 2022. So it will give you a response that relates to that. Now, I could ask it to go out and augment that information with stuff that it has access to from the internet, but this is what it gives us at the moment.
Yeah, they're always conservative. We train them to be conservative.
So there was a period where it would really try and give you back positive, nice, happy feelings. They kind of threw that out the window. It's going to respond to you in a more realistic way now.
Okay, so thank you. And we might come back to it if we have time with other questions. I would have a few in stock as well. Mita, so can you talk a bit more about the business models behind all this, and this, I think as librarians, you think about that, you think about access, you think about, those license fees you have to pay that seem, by how many times you're reading specific, books online or whatever. So can you tell us, how this is shaping up and, in a way, that is, directly affecting us?
Yes, and sometimes it's a difficult question to answer because some of these businesses, admittedly, have not figured out how to be profitable. This is it's a speculation on speculation on speculation. But Chat-GPT, it's also interesting. It's particularly interesting because in some ways it modeled itself as a replacement search engine. The way to understand it is that they receive. I think it was like 1.7 billion requests in the month of October. Those include, and it's like one of the top 20 websites of the world. Now, I looked at some stats, and Bing is still more popular than ChatGPT, largely because Bing at this point is bankrolled by Microsoft, and they're not asking for money at this point. Whereas I believe with ChatGPT, it's $20 per month US. And so there's that subscription model. And for some professions, if you are a coder, for example, and your favorite source is GitHub, and because that's where all your code is and that's where your code community is, and if something doesn't work, you can ask a request. You can have GitHub Copilot, and that is growing to be an indispensable tool for those who work in programming. However, there was an unreleased or an unofficial memo that has not been confirmed nor denied from Microsoft saying that they are losing money on each, even though they charge something, I think $30 a month, they're still losing money. So if they're losing $30 now, that cost will go up. So how we think of the products are really important, because if they are a utility that's essential, that all of a sudden we're building services that we can't live without them, then we remember how cheap Netflix was when it started. We remember how much it is now. What are the viable alternatives? If you go to earlier this year, time is funny. I went to a funny thing. Took my family and we went to New York City. And we went to MoMA, and they have an exhibition about digital visualizations, and they have an entire wall. It's an art piece from 2018, and it is the anatomy of AI, and it takes up the entire wall, and it's beautiful, and it's by Kate Hudson, and another person, and it's the model of a system that was the cutting edge system of that time, which has lost $10 billion since then. And they've just last month, the company that was responsible for it cut a massive amount of that workforce. And that was the Amazon Echo service. So this understanding of the ability to chat, or the ability to have an interface where you don't have to type or think, has historically been over-prescribed. It's very easy, it's very simple, but after a while, it's not something that we would pay $20 a month or $30 a month. So that's something to be mindful. Where the other place where we have integration of AI is in the existing products that we have, right? So, and what's particularly interesting and possibly troubling about that is that it's not always a choice. So if you're using Adobe Photoshop, that now has AI. I don't know whether you've seen ads on television for an Android Pixel phone where they say, wow, there's a garbage can in the background of your photograph. You can just wipe it away. Well, what if you want to pride yourself on the veracity of your photos? Can you opt out? And again, these are larger questions. And then there's the third way, which we aren't as familiar with, which is the ability of running it in a local way, running it on your laptop, running it on a Raspberry Pi, running it on very small infrastructure that you can make sure that you can trust that the information doesn't leave you and your computer. Because one of the challenging aspects about AI is that the requests that you make to these systems are not encrypted. So they can be harvested, and as the AI systems, they do threaten the sort of global commons of the internet, because why put all my information about my favorite, I don't know, comics, what's the point of putting all my answering questions on Stack Overflow or be helpful on the internet or in Reddit or any of these places if someone else is just going to take those answers and sell them? And the advertising model collapses and there's no reason to put new content in a public place. So the way that I like to think of the promise of AI is that it replaces a free library, which whether that's the internet or the actual library, and it replaces it with a $30 a month librarian. That's how I actually think of it. And I'm worth much more than that.
Okay. Yep.
I don't know if we were getting stuff in the gallery here. Oh, okay.
Just so everyone can hear you.
Hi, just an introduction. I am actually, I'm a graduate from University of Windsor, and I actually have a master's degree in library science. So I'm a bit of a librarian too, but I have a bit of a, oh geez, that's really, I actually make all of my money selling books online that are generated using AI. They're fantasy books, Dungeons and Dragons books, and well, I have a couple of things here. You said that Microsoft is losing money on every inference that they do, and same with Chat-GPT. That is true. They are losing money on their subscriptions, but that is only because they are generating synthetic data. They are generating high quality data using the models that they feed back, and they create distilled models. They just recently upgraded Chat-GPT 4 to GPT-4 Turbo, which is they don't publish the specs, but if you know how these things work, it's probably a lower parameter count, so it's actually cheaper for them to run, but it has the same kind of performance. They get that by generating data from the customers. So it's free. The reason it's free is because you are the product. It's not because they're giving you something generously. They're using it to train further models that they can use in the further. Like Microsoft wants to integrate this all into Windows and everything, so they need models that are cheaper, and that's what they're doing. There's also open source models. I've worked with Open Assistant, which is a version of Llama released by Meta. They released their model weights open source, which is, I think it's insane, but it's great for everyone because people can train their own models and they can make them uncensored. So if you want a model that will tell you how to make a bomb, you can get that from various open models. But they are much lower parameter count. You can't run an open model that's nearly as intelligent as GPT-4 yet. But there are a number of new technologies that are coming down the pipeline, new kinds of GPUs that are being made that will allow these sort of models to be run at a GPT-4 level within a year or two.
Did you have a question? Did you have a question?
Oh, sorry. I was wondering if you had, like, you talked about putting stuff on the internet is a bad idea now because people are going to harvest it for training the models and it's going to make you irrelevant. I release all of my books completely Creative Commons. If someone wants to take my book and publish it themselves and make a profit off it, they can do that legally. And I would be perfectly happy because the Creative Commons license I use is an attribution license. So they would have to give me credit for that. And it takes me an afternoon to write an 800-page book that I can publish. So all I care about is my reputation as an author. Well, author, editor, whatever you want to call me, prompt engineer. So...
Can I just speak to that?
Yeah.
I think you overstated my claim. I didn't say that putting things on the internet is not a worthwhile endeavor. I'm saying that what it does is it disrupts the existing advertising model. What I'm actually personally more concerned about is the communities. There's a very fascinating lawsuit that's going right now that's against the Copilot initiative, and it works on the basis that, yes, the code was there, but by harvesting it and turning it into an AI service, it's essentially destroyed entire open source communities where normally it wasn't a defect to have a person ask someone else for help, because that's how you built a mentorship system. It disrupted that completely. And so you're finding system after system, Stack Overflow, all these other communities that are being disrupted because it is a very antisocial technology. So there is a cost, and not all costs are monetary.
Can I respond to that a little bit?
Okay.
Actually, I'd like to hear my speakers.
We'll have some later. And actually, to your point about creative books, we're going to talk about some copyright issues. So I think that would be interesting to get your perspective later on. Yeah, for sure. So just bringing it more to the students, researchers here to the university. So how do you, and I'm asking the question generally to all panelists, how do you envisage Chat-GPT and generative AI how is it going to transform academics, students, librarians' approach to research, to writing, and as well as the output in the academic discourse? It's a big question, and you can take it, in whatever shape or form you take. So maybe we're going to start with our student. How do you see this shaping up as a student?
I think that there are a lot of obviously positive uses, really good uses for this that can help, and even more administrative tasks. If to save time for law students, time is important. To use it to help with your calendaring or summaries, something like that. But I find that I think that with the unknown with respect to university policies and actually what we're aiming to learn from a certain task, like if we're learning to write a brief or a memo, we don't want the computer to write it for us, because now we're not getting anything from that. And so I think that there's a line that we have to walk appropriately, ethically, and to be able to actually learn what we're trying to learn. But then when we come into contact with the university policies, for example, if I wanted to put a syllabus through Chat-GPT to have it create a schedule for me, or what readings are due when, something like that, that could be a violation of university policy if we are not allowed to be making the syllabi public or something like that. Like that's where it's questionable, and I think that's where we might need some guidance.
Mm-hmm. And let me ask maybe students in the room, maybe you want to answer or not answer that question, but if there's any uses that you found useful so far of Chat-GPT, of AI. Statistically, it is quite used, right? The data you're gathering on campus is that it is quite used.
Yeah, I mean, we're not actively gathering data on campus of who's using what, but all of the students' surveys that you see...
That's what I meant, surveys, not that we're gathering. We don't want to scare you.
I mean, we could, but that seems like a bad idea. But, we've seen that rapidly change throughout the last year. Students approach these with lots of fear and concern and worries about what's going to be appropriate for them and not. And as it becomes more normalized, we're certainly seeing, there's been a raft of information come out all around the world, and they're all roughly about the same. 75 to 90% of students are actively using them. I know in my courses right now, I mean, we actively engage with them. But a shift from the start of term to now, if I were to walk around the room, I would see probably 85 or 90% of my students have one of the tools open on screen at any given time, as opposed to early on where it was one or two people that I knew were really interested in it. So they're using them in really different ways, though. Mm-hmm. I was on a panel yesterday with a group of students who were students with disabilities, and they had complex disabilities that had found a series of different tools that could make their life work. You know, they were really just trying to use it to reduce the barriers to their work. And actually 3 of them were law students, not from here, from other institutions. But their story was about how they'd been disabled by their institutions all the way through their academic careers, and now suddenly they felt they were able to perform at their best. But the way in which they were using them, creating things like a timetable, or one student who had dyslexia, who could have an oral conversation with you and present his argument, but to write that was impossible for him. There'd be chunks of data, chunks of information that someone else couldn't understand, and he could read it and go, well, it makes sense to me. But he's using a tool that can restructure his paragraphs to a narrative that makes sense to someone else reading it. And there are all sorts of different ways in which students, particularly students with disabilities, are using these tools because they just haven't had access to the support that they need.
Mita, did you want to add something?
Yes, I'll just add briefly. I like the fact also of the phrase that they were made disabled by their institution, as opposed to a state of being. I'm going to take that. That's fascinating. I think I don't think all the. I found that I was the naysayer of this group. I don't think all of AI is going to necessarily be terrible. And then, in fact, I think one of the more positive reactions that might come from, again, the reaction of the reaction, is that we will no longer have as much reliance on the fact that we will understand that students have learned because they gave us an essay. Already, one of the things that I've learned about Windsor law is that it prides itself on all of this experiential learning, right? When you are involved in a class action suit, or you're involved in participating in legal aid, all of these, this is a sort of direction that we're moving into, is that the learning is through the process. And that's something that I've learned from the good folks at the Office of Open Learning, is that phrase of, well, what if the learning is the process? That, and using sports metaphors, it's the work of going through it is the learning itself. And there's obviously, and it does show the promise of a whole new different forms of reading. What if, how many papers can you read in one night versus can you read 10,000 papers? Or can you find a lead, or can you find a connection? It can be a great vehicle for curiosity.
This is okay.
Just one more thing to add. I think that it takes the professors and the institution to be open-minded to this type of use, so that students don't feel like so that the use isn't stigmatized. I feel like that's how it is now. If you have Chat-GPT open on your computer, then people think you're cheating or something like that, which isn't necessarily the case.
And just as a segue to what you were saying, Mita, about, it's really about learning is about the process. If I can just jump in and tell my perspective, which is really evolving as we speak. I'm thinking, about different ways of how we should approach this as we're looking at these questions. And so it makes me, as an instructor, think about the evaluation tools that I'm using. And you may not know this, students, but we think long and hard about, the evaluation in each of our courses. What do we want you to learn? What are the skills that we want you to really perfect as you are here with us? And, the paper is something that I'm thinking about, and having listened to some of the comment on that. I think, for when we're thinking about training future lawyers, or, there are people from other departments here with us today, there are things that are not going to change, right? You want to nurture the development of strong analytical, critical skills, good writing, good oral, advocacy and so forth, rigor. All these things are not going to change. But I think, having been there long enough to see various evolutions of how we use technology, it's just where are we going to put the focus? So I remember the days where I had to go in the library, manually, and just, one book would take me to another. There were little colors, and Annette is looking at me smiling. And, there was nothing about the internet, doing searches on the internet. And that was, what we had. And they were all norms and customs as to what we could search. I remember a partner when I was starting in a law firm saying, I was talking about doing a search online. No, 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 don't do that. Don't use that. Like being really, really scared about this. Lawyers tend to be risk adverse. So things that, took us a certain amount of time before, I'm a bit critical about, whether it's always more efficient, because there's just so much more now and we tend to get lost in the quality of the information. But I'm thinking about things like Zotero, for example, that can actually search in all of you were talking about a closed network, and search in all of your writings, everything that you've done, and you sort of, you just ask questions and you want to, because you forget about this source that talked about, I don't know, privacy law at the intersection of copyright. And also how it helps you with your footnotes. We used to always have to do that manually. Now you have things that can generate it for you. The big difference, like the big disruptor here, is that no longer, it's not just for the technical, helping you with spell check and everything. It's, as Brandon is saying, it's actually the whole critical thinking that we're nurturing, we're seeking to develop. Don't be fooled at this point, certainly in time, to think that you can sort of outsource this to the machine. And that's kind of a breaking point, and where we are all thinking about, so what it is that we need to communicate to you in terms of our expectation of, Chat-GPT. It's one thing to use it. Okay, I've done my research, I've done my, I have my outline. Let's ask a question and say, oh, I didn't think about that. Right? So that's one use. I think that can be a productive use. It's another one, and we can talk about that later, when you sort of incorporate it in your actual, writing. And then this is where it gets you, as of today, into questions of the current policy guidelines in terms of academic integrity, that you have to represent that this is your own work, and so forth. And you think, was it Brendan or?
I just want to add, one of the challenges of a lot of our systems is that writing used to take a long time. And now writing is really, really fast and reading takes a long time. Mm-hmm. And many of our systems that are based on peer review, every time if you ask your faculty member, they'll probably be really sad because they're working on a grant proposal and it's very arduous, or all of these processes takes massive amounts of time that can happen quite quickly. So I really think that there's some after effects that will come from it. I think we may see the end of blind peer review, because we want to make sure that I don't want to proofread robot work. I just don't. I want to have a person. And I think that text that is generic, that comes out from the ether as some sort of authority, is going to be less valued over time, whereas I think the individual, what does one person say? Who do you align with? Who are you? I think the after effect is that we'll be much more opinionated in our writing, because we want to differentiate ourselves from a very sort of, it's a lot of text. When we have lots of experience in that, we used to write really great, pithy tweets that used to get people really mad.
And the other thing I wanted to add, looking at this from an instructor, is that I hear from some students, and I've heard that more at the undergraduate level, that they think that AI is going to do a better job than themselves sometimes, that they want to. They're just insecure about so much information out there. And I would really want to debunk that idea that, more is not better. Thinking that just by asking a question and that there's just going to be a bunch of information coming back, that it's going to produce something that is better. And I think by the illustrations that have been given, this is already quite clear. And also, the way I think we should think about it is that, well, certainly as future lawyers, certainly as students, there's an accountability factor. And in the legal profession, there is something about having to vet your work. We heard about the controversy about someone citing cases, bringing them to court, and the cases didn't exist. That's really, really a big disgrace, actually, to the law profession, to the judge, actually, the representation that was made to the judge. Anyway, there's also this idea that, for me at least, sometimes it takes more time to start from a draft that someone has provided to me than to start from scratch. Just on this idea of being accountable and being able to actually justify your source. You have to be able to. That's a big thing. I think it's generally the case for science, but certainly in law, the quality of your argument is going to be dependent on the sources that you're going to use, and and there's a hierarchy in the sources that you use. You know, a Supreme Court decision does not have the same value and authoritative force than, you know, a secondary source. So, I mean, having to do all this work, you know, I think to me at this point, at least from what I understand, that the tools can be actually asking for more work than less work, you know, than.
I think where you're going to see that change, though, is that the advent of tools like LexisNexis having AI built into it, or Westlaw having AI built into it, those change that dynamic, because you're not asking Chat-GPT, which is your drunk, really smart friend who once read a law paper. That's you're actually querying the corpus of legal knowledge, and so that changes, you know, the quality of the response that you get. I think people will, certainly for you becoming practicing lawyers, there will be an expectation that you're literate in AI tools and that you'll be using them in practice. And we know that they're already being used in practice all over the place, sometimes inappropriately. So that's something that you really need to, that we as an institution need to help you achieve. And I think that people will find workflows that work differently for them. Some people will work well with an AI assistant, where you start from, I write my thing first, and you ask for, what are the things that I missed, or what are the connections that I'm missing here, or I write it in French and I need it translated to English, and then I can check it, or you know, there are all sorts of different ways that could work. Or you could start with it from, here's the problem that I'm trying to solve. What can you point me to a starting point for cases? What things can I find that exist? And then I'll go right from there. And I think that's a much more critical approach to then giving it the question and write me something on this. I think we pretty quickly moved through that period into, okay, this thing's real and it's here, and now how do we use this safely and ethically and appropriately in each of our disciplines?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so on that note, I'm wondering if at some point the law school will introduce a course to teach the students how to use these tools appropriately.
Yeah, this is definitely something we're thinking about, for sure. And this discussion and just thinking about it is very helpful, actually. And it would not be necessarily just focused on AI, but definitely, you know, various tools. And on, you know, your point, Nick, and maybe I can point to Annette, who was doing some really cool stuff with your students. What are the uses of LexisNexis of AI today, as we speak today? How is it incorporated already in the search tools that we have? Do you want to say a word about that?
Sure. And actually, I would just say that there's actually products out there that are a little bit ahead of the game in terms of being built on legal information. So both Lexis and Westlaw are most well-resourced corporations for law for Canada. And so they are definitely all in putting resources into building out these products. And so if you have the right, if you pay the subscription for that service, you can theoretically ask it a question and it will give you a written response that includes footnotes. That's essentially where they're at. But you have to be willing to pay and all that. Now, we have products that are startup companies that are curating their collections of law for Canada in specific areas and adding special value add. So, for example, Blue Jay Legal, they have a huge collection of tax cases that they've specifically coded to make it easier for AI to read it. And they are not necessarily synthesizing an analysis answer for us yet. They are providing some kind of answer for us, but it's more, they're leaving it to us to finish the analysis. Whereas something like Alexi is built on a variety of case law from across Canada, and that will generate a legal memo for you. And it will also give you your footnotes and all the rest of it. Now, Alexi in particular has been supervised on the training side, and up until a week ago, up until a week ago, was also supervised on the output side. So nothing left their offices, if you want to call it that, until it was supervised by a lawyer. They have now decided to let it fledge, and it now will generate unsupervised outputs. So the development is super rapid across all the legal platforms in Canada. Those are what I would call, I call them conscientious developers, because they are building on the Canadian primary law, and they're preserving the integrity of the sources themselves. So we still have to keep our eye on them from a lot of perspectives, because we don't know the scope of the data that they're putting in there. Are they referring to Supreme Court cases going all the way back to 1876? Or is it only from the 1980s? They are not making that available and transparent to us. So there are some of us in the law library world that are working on standards for our legal platforms. You must provide us the scope of these databases. You must provide us like a whole checklist that people should be looking at. So anyways, sorry, I think that's a bit
No,
long
but
of an
that's an
answer,
excellent point. That was my question earlier to you. So how do we know? Like the user needs to know, right? About, what is this? So certainly for lawyers, it's super important for us to know. So I think we need to tee up with you guys as we're thinking about,
Can I have a
developing
follow?
some guidelines. It's really, and these companies and what they're doing. That's really, really a good point.
I have a follow-up question for you as a copyright expert, which is if I wanted to create my own notebook of my own writings, but I also wanted to include all my textbooks, is there any hope that we can have Canadian legislation that I could do that legally?
And you want to make them available to the public?
No, just my own.
For private use, there's no problem.
Oh, there we go.
Go for it, Nita.
Could I?
Which brings me to the next, actually.
But I can't share that with my library.
No, unless, we could make it pass under fair dealing. But fair dealing, that would be a very generous interpretation of fair dealing.
Okay, thank
That's
you.
my sense right now.
Sure.
Which brings me to the next point, which, we had advertised that we'd talk about some of the controversies in copyright, in privacy law, and, environmental issues. There are a lot of controversies out there. Labor, we don't even have a chance to speak about, the disruption in terms of the labor forces and so forth. So I think we'll spend maybe the next 10 minutes or so about talking about that. And one of them, and that points to a question that there was earlier on and a comment, is about, of course, all the controversies we hear about copyright. And before talking about that, I'm just going to say what we're hearing a lot, and Nick and Mita and also Brendan have talked about this so far in AI, is AI not respecting anti-discrimination laws. Right, so that's kind of the big, and there's a lot of research about AI being the danger of it being biased, and there's some really neat empirical studies that actually show that yes, in some instances it is very biased, and actually I can just as an introduction before jumping into the privacy and copyright issue, say that that's actually what our government is looking at right now. Like you might have heard about Bill C-27, the AI Data Act. And that's one of the concerns that they are seeking to address as we speak. So the reference to, just going to use the actual language, biased output. There's a whole definition in the bill of the act talking about that. And this bill, for those of you who are less familiar with it, which was launched in 2022, as just sat on the shelves, was resurrected, is being discussed right now, is really baby steps, I think, in the terms of management of AI about addressing it's kind of a governance about requiring disclosure, risk management. There are categories of AI that are being defined, the ones that can really affect our lives. If you're just playing, just to develop a video game, that's one thing. But if it's something that may impact decisions that are made in a company and so forth, that there are certain degrees of disclosure and penalties that are involved. So that's the big thing we've been hearing. There's certainly in law the whole question of use of AI by the judicial system, due process of law, basically when decisions are being made. Again, there's the bias issue, but there's also an accountability factor about what is being what is generating, what's the substance. When we read a decision, I think there's transparency. You may not agree with the judge, but there's transparency in the process that is being. Why did I arrive at this reasoning. With AI, the danger is that, yeah, you don't see that anymore. Like, why do you make a decision on parole, on bail, immigration tribunal, and so forth? So these are the big, big risks that we have, that certainly have made the news. The other one I'm going to talk more about is about and on that, there's actually a voluntary code before the law is enforced that has just come up in September 2023, inviting companies to some general guidelines, even before the law is enforced, in terms of how they are using AI. I didn't see a lot of uptake. When I checked, like the big companies are not there, but BlackBerry is there, of the kind of non-Canadian companies. For whatever that means, but there's not a big uptake. But let's move on now to copyright. The copyright issues, there are a lot you will have heard about, a lot of controversies. There's at least, I can think of at least 15 lawsuits against OpenAI right now from Getty Images, from collectives of very renowned authors and so forth. And generally, for those controversies, they revolve around, can their work being used to train AI and to generate various works? But the first controversy is about who is the author of AI-generated work. And I think there's really neat stuff that I will encourage the university, and I made a note about that's, from the corporate perspective, that can be helpful as we develop our guidelines. So, the issue of the man and the machine, the person and the machine, is not new. This is something that we've been certainly in copyright looking at for several years. The human-machine interaction does not prohibit, photographer from owning the copyright to their photography, even though the camera does a lot of the work. Same thing for, using camera for cinema or seismic data production has been recognized as, even the machine is very complex, as what it generates can be protected by copyright. But what complicates the matter, or what sort of helps assess whether, when you use AI, whether you can still be calling yourself an author, is there's a test in several jurisdictions. In Canada, there's a test for originality. And you have to show that there is enough skill and judgment in the output, in the expression of, what comes out. Copyright only protects expression, doesn't protect ideas in your mind and so forth. And this derives from a very famous decision, the CCH decision by the Supreme Court of 2004. So that's the question. And so it can exist, but the tricky thing in copyright is that an author can only be a physical person. That's really clear in the Act. That's really clear in the US. That's really clear. So it's okay if you use the machine, but there definitely this creative expression and this sort of control over the creative output needs to come from a physical person. So when we take the example of AI, if it's strictly generated, if you just put prompts, you just gave prompts, the output, you have no control over the output. Well, this is not protected by copyright. This cannot be protected by copyright. Or the AI, that portion is not protected by copyright. So this is actually, there's really useful guidance, I find, on that issue by the U.S. Copyright Office that was issued in May, I think, 2023. And it's called Copyright Registration Guidance, Works Containing Material Generated by Artificial Intelligence. And they really, I think it's a very helpful tool to guide us in terms of, where do you draw the line as to when you're using, AI. It doesn't say that when you use AI, you will never be able to claim authorship on the output. It just gives some guidelines as to when you won't be able to. So I'll just read a few quotations from that corporate registry guidance. When an AI technology determines the expressive elements of its output, the generated material is not the product of human authorship. This not protected by copyright. What matters is the extent to which the human had creative control over the work's expression and actually formed the traditional elements of authorship. They also give guidance as to the registration process. You don't need to register copyright to be entitled to be protected. Actually, it's a fundamental rule that you should not impose on anyone to register. But if you do register your copyright, here's some guidance that the Copyright Registry Office gives. Applicants have a duty to disclose the inclusion of AI-generated content in a work submitted for registration and to provide a brief explanation of the human author's contributions. AI-generated content that is more than de minimis should be explicitly excluded from the application. You should specifically state that. So I think this is not dissimilar from what we're thinking about here when we're thinking about guidelines in terms of, disclosure. We're seeing this at the Court of Appeal level that recently launched a request that people using AI make the disclosure, and that's what we're thinking here at the university as well. So we have the same idea. We don't have anything at Canada at the moment. We are looking at copyright revisions as we speak. There are some submissions that are expected to take place in early December. There were some in 2021 to which I and other colleagues contributed, and they were, nothing happened from those, and they're just saying things have changed so much. Things have changed so much. Let's just rethink about this, and let's just take another crack at it. That's basically what's happening. But we don't have those specific guidelines at the Canadian level. But the controversy, and this is pointing to some of the comments that have been made, that are made by authors, by musicians, and the like, are with respect to the reuse of their work. People are really, really upset. People feel that they're ripped off, and so forth. And this is another question. So the question there is, when AI, the machine, sort of uses these sources, is training on those models and generate outputs, is it infringing copyright? So that's the big, big, big question. So for there to be copyright infringement, the people who are actually claiming, making the claims right now, will need to show that the machine actually has reproduced. It's not just sort of read. So that's a subtle question, but has actually reproduced in the process. Is scraping, actually reproducing, and so forth. So it's a very technical question at the heart here of this controversy. But even if there is reproduction, would exceptions to copyright infringement kick in? Fair use in the US, which is similar to fair dealing in Canada, but has quite distinctive features. So if in the process there is enough transformation of the original work, this may not be copyright infringement. And this is what OpenAI is arguing right now. But also in the US, and we don't have the same thing here in Canada, you could be infringing on the basis that this constitutes a derivative work. But in all of those instances, in other than reproduction, you would have to establish that actually the output is a substantial reproduction of the underlying work that you're alleging is infringing. So that might not be obvious. So that the whole thing about, feeding on millions of materials does not necessarily mean that you're going to be able to establish that there is something in the output that is actually substantially similar to the original work. So that's that these are some of the big questions that we have. It might get a bit more dicey when we're asking, for example, AI, give me rendering of a song in the genre of Jay-Z, for example. And there were two examples, Canadian ones about Drake and The Weeknd. Also, then you get into maybe more murky waters about maybe being able to make a link of substantial reproduction, and you may get into the issue of moral rights, which is there is a distortion of the work. So in a nutshell, it does not necessarily follow from a copyright law perspective that because your photo, musical piece, and so forth was sort of used in training the AI model, that this will lead to copyright infringement. And it's there's a bigger issue of sustainability of our cultural industries. These are much, much bigger questions than copyright. But I will stop here for the sort of controversies sum up. Another controversy, before I talk about privacy, maybe we can look at the environmental footprint that AI sort of represents. We don't think about that. We're always thinking, oh, stop printing, and this is Vince, Dr. Menzerl's really fundamental research work, looking at the underlying infrastructure, how much energy is this taking. So do you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, that supply chain of training particularly is really resource intensive, at least with the early models it was. Now, it doesn't actually need to be. It doesn't need to be that intensive. But what happens is when you get a company like Google or Microsoft or Amazon who have massive resources, then they tend to think in terms of bigger being better, and we'll just throw everything that we have at it. What's really interesting is if you look at something like Bloom, which is an open source model trained using green energy through access to computing capacity in France, that model used about a third or less than a quarter actually of the energy that GPT-4 used to train, with a larger number of parameters, and it's openly accessible and is kind of given out to the community. So there is, and since that one was released, we've seen lots of other smaller models. To your point earlier, lots of those smaller models actually perform quite well. And we've moved away a lot from really intensive cycles of feedback and training with massive amounts of data to smaller, more focused, better, cleaner data sets that use much less energy and use a much faster process for training. In fact, they really don't use those earlier models anymore. So I think we're seeing a shift, and some of the larger players taking some responsibility for that, at least being transparent about how much energy it's costing. Microsoft particularly had released data on the amount of water that it took to train GPT-4 in Indiana, where they trained it in their one of their data centers there. So it consumed something like a quarter of the town's potable water for the period in which it was training. It's a huge amount of resources being pulled into that. So I think what we're also likely to see, and we're already seeing it in some other parts of the world, shifting data centers to places where it's a balance between having environmental conditions that require you to use less energy because it's cooler climate, you can manage your heat sinks a lot better, and having access to green energy or renewable sources. I think that's where most of the large companies will tend to gravitate, simply because it's so much cheaper. It costs a lot to train these models. Now, the challenge becomes how we sustain them and the amount of energy that it takes for us to interact with that. So every time you use Chat-GPT, for example, the average conversation with Chat-GPT requires about 50, pieces of information that go backwards and forwards, and that takes about a half a liter of water of cooling for a data center somewhere. So all of that ramps up, and if you multiply that by the 8 major models that are out now, plus all of the other derivations of that, it really ramps up quickly. There are some estimates that at present, as of this month, I think the combined usage of energy for data centers just for AI for the big 4 is roughly about the same amount of energy that Denmark uses annually. So it's a really huge amount of energy, and we have to find a way to manage that.
Yeah, it's a little bit not the most cheerful information, but something I think, again, we could have a whole panel designed just talking about that. But that's definitely something that we did want to raise and briefly talk about, and connects to other work, Center for Cities, other work that our other centers here at the university are doing. I'm just looking at the time. We are, quickly getting closer to the end of our talk today. I would run amiss if I didn't say a few words about privacy controversy as well. I have some privacy law students nodding here. And I'll try to be brief about that, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions and some concluding remarks. There's a lot of layers, and some of the layers of privacy law connect also to copyright issues that I mentioned earlier on. But let's think about at least 3 scenarios for now. So the first one is the use of your own personal data. If you use Chat-GPT, for example, if you use it as a personal assistant, right? This is what Chat-GPT can become, as Amita was referring to, something kind of more of a closed network. Well, then it would depend on, of course, reading the fine print when you're using that service, just like any other service where you provide personal data. This is something we are very much looking into in my class in terms of the sort of the illusory aspect of consent that is given. Are you really giving consent? And a lot of loopholes allowing companies to reuse that data, right? So the question there is a simple and a very complex answer. It's really depending on what the terms and conditions would be and what the law will be. I mean, we're also, as we're speaking, Bill C-27 also includes a component about strengthening. It is alleged, the rules with respect to what can be done in the use of personal data information. But there have been some scandals, and maybe you will want to talk about that, about information that has been leaked, people using personal information to get a question from AI, generative AI. Then there's another sort of bigger question that concerns data scraping, to train AI, all the information that needs to be gathered in order to actually make the solution interesting and appealing. And there, well, I'm thinking this is a major disruption, to privacy law, just like AI use, massive use to even generate content, to impersonate actors and everything is a massive disruption in many ways. There's a big one. It's like a tsunami. It's a bulldozer, just taking all this information, neglecting that there are privacy laws applicable. And not later than August 2023, the various privacy commissioners around the world have gathered together and issued a statement about saying, wait a minute, all this data that is being scrapped actually raises a lot of privacy issues. Privacy law experts, privacy law students will know that it's not because something is on the internet, freely available, that it doesn't, that you can use it as you want. That the personal information, personal data that connects to a person can be used freely. So there's a big warning that is being made, and I'll just summarize a few points that are being made in that sort of collective sort of statement that actually, you may be liable. So either OpenAI may be liable in the use of the data if it amounts to actually use of personal data that is still identifiable to a person. And you have to follow a lot of steps under Canadian law. You have to inform the person whose data is collected. You have to have a very consistent purpose. You have to explain the purpose. If it's an illegal purpose or whatever, that will not fly. That will be illegal. Social media companies may also be on the hook. So may have a liability and a responsibility to protect through firewalls how this data is being accessed, because they might be actually in infringement of personal data protection laws. They may have to report some of the information that is being collected through data scraping might amount to a data hack, and they might have to report under our current legislation, as you may know, you have to report this to your consumer base, to your user base when that happens. And they make a few recommendations about how individuals can take steps to protect their personal information from data scraping, and social media can do so. So it will be interesting to see, what happens in Bill C-27 in that regard. That's not something that's part of the new bill, but it will be interesting to see how this is being addressed. And then another thing I thought I would say with respect to, and there's several other controversies concerning privacy law, but one is the scenario of the AI impersonation of artists, right? So we're seeing this, right? So the rendering of, I don't know, Taylor Swift or, Drake or Jay-Z or Beyonce or whatever. What does that mean, from a privacy perspective? It is very much of a privacy issue without the consent of the person. And this could lead, as students in privacy law will know, to the tort of appropriation of personality, which includes, and it can be much more serious. It could lead to identity fraud and something. But just let's think about the impersonation of artists, where, if the person is identifiable, if you are using the plaintiff's personality, which clearly is the case in this impersonation without consent for the the person who's doing this for their own benefit and purpose, usually a commercial benefit, and there's no public interest purpose in doing that. So if you're doing an autobiography of a famous artist, you may use a lot of personal information about them, but it serves a public interest function, and it's very much part of the creative process. But if it's just for making money, and there's nothing, really in the public interest and do that, well, you might be contributing to a tort, and it can connects to those zones that I referred to, those nebulous zones, and how AI may be used and raised to copyright infringement. So if it's not giving rise to copyright infringement, it may be a privacy issue. And also the same thing with recognizable genre of music that are being used. Sometimes it may not fit squarely into copyright infringement, but it may be an appropriation of personality of the artist in question. So these issues are really akin to what we see in copyright as moral rights, as to the distortion when we're talking about impersonation of artists, for example, and I could think of many other examples. They are not. It's not a lawless land. It's just a question of, I think, people screaming left, right, and center about needing some guidance and laws that are more strictly, prescriptive in what you can do other than the general common law that is applicable. So that's it, sort of in a very, very quick overview for some of the controversies that we wanted to address today. We could talk about many, many more. We have a few minutes maybe for questions or maybe for concluding thoughts from our panelists, things that you were burning to say that you didn't have a chance to say. Yes.
A lot of the talk about new policies and stuff kind of assumes.
Just a little easier.
Speak closer.
Yeah. There you go.
A lot of the talk about new policies seems to kind of assume that the AIs will be as they are now and not become more advanced. Do you have any forward-thinking ideas? Because like Chat-GPT 4, like people have said, it's like a drunk toddler. It's going to grow up, and what happens when it has its own moral rights? Like if it's at the tier of a human, is it immoral to say you're not allowed to read copywritten works? I mean, if it's a sentient creature.
Well, you're always allowed to read. That's
Yeah.
not an issue. That's not a copyright infringement issue. There's no problem there. It's when you fall into the reproduction, substantial parts, sort of era. In terms of your question about sort of being forward-looking, I think laws, as much as they're always behind. Laws are always, way behind, and everyone knows that who's studied law for, a few years or practiced law. I think, the framework we're seeing right now is really about accountability. It's major principle risk management. It doesn't get into what it's actually doing. It's really about what's the risk here, and be aware. It's putting pressure on organizations using AI to to manage the risk and with hefty fines if they don't, actually. It's really, the pressure point is really on that more than what it actually does, and identifying, and taking extra care and constantly sort of reviewing, and testing, a lot of testing. That's what we're seeing in the models that we have right now. Any other thoughts that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think what you're pointing to largely too is that our responsibility is more around development of literacy and competency rather than training you how to use a tool, right? Because that's always a fraught thing, because the tool's always going to change, it's always going to get better, it's always going to, shift in that landscape. So our responsibility is to try and help faculty, staff, and students become literate enough so that they can, when they come up against a question like that, can at least have an informed conversation about it, or know where to go to ask that question to get extra advice or support or understanding, because it's we can't anticipate at this point, I think, what those changes even next year are going to look like. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not. I work sometimes in the futures realm, so thinking about how do you imagine futures that are preferable or perhaps dangerous, or there are lots of ways that you can approach that. Even future thinking doesn't get you anywhere where you need to be with AI, I don't think. I think we're currently working around these ideas of speculative futures because we just simply can't imagine, we don't have the capacity to imagine all of the uses that we're likely to see even in the short term. This is a really massive disruption.
A lot of questions.
We had one in
Hi, I'm Fahad. I am
Sorry,
from.
can you repeat
sorry,
your name?
my name is Fahad, and I'm from Business Data Analytics program from ODET Business School, and this is my last semester here. I'm graduating in April. So my question is, and for a lot of our academic work, we work with the ML models and that sort of stuff. So in terms of business, my question is where we are in terms of AI fairness. Why model is predicting the outcome, which is predicting right now whatever we are feeding the data into. And we have seen in the cases, for example, in the case of Amazon, there were some racial bias about hiring females, and there's in the medical field, for example, it detects the maybe cancer wrong to the person, or for example, social justice or law in terms of why there's a particular set of group was, has more penalized rather than the other section. So where we are in terms of fairness and how it is important, in terms of generating AI or building models in that sense. Thank you.
I'll say something really quickly, and then I'll give it to Mita, because I think we're thinking along the same lines. I think that there are a couple of things that I want to point to. One is the critical importance of maintaining an open ecosystem for these models as a counterbalance to the commercial outputs that we're seeing. I think that's really important. The other thing is that there are those, and it's a smaller group, but there are those who are dedicated to the ethical and responsible use of AI. And I think we have to find ways to protect companies like Eleuther that are, just dedicated to that kind of work, because they're critically important. And it's entirely possible to build models that don't have the kinds of biases that we have had before. There just hasn't been a will to do that, and it takes a little bit of work. So,
Thank you. I know. I think if it's the Amazon case that I think of, some years ago, Amazon wanted to look for new candidates to hire, and so they modeled it after their existing successful candidates, and then they did an audit. A third party did an audit and found out that their successful candidates were the ones that had backgrounds in lacrosse and their names closer to Jared. So the closer your name was to Jared, the closer you were going to model the ideal Amazon employee. So you're right. There is a whole challenge, and just to sum up, essentially 3 points. One, there needs to be systems like audit systems. 2, decision making. We're talking about, at least when the context I'm talking about, I'm only talking about sort of AI in an informational, not making a capacity for decision making. We have to be careful that we are not the person who's the fall person when the AI makes a problem and somebody needs to be fired. There's a moral crumple zone, and it has to be a person. The moral crumple zone AI article is wonderful. There is a quotation which is machine learning is laundry for bias. Anytime that we use, and it's not just AI, it's any algorithm, and we've always grappled with this problem of redlining, of all of these things where the challenge becomes, why didn't I get that job? Why didn't I get my loan? Why is the price so much higher than my friend? And it's calculated by an AI. So the answer that I would have is there needs to be some sort of form where transparency, at least, and the challenge that the fundamental difference between what regular algorithms were was it was supposed to be math. AI has a random number generator, and that's that stochastic part where it's wonderful and creative, but you ask it the same question twice, and it won't necessarily give you the same answer the next day. And again, the question is, that's the question in this moment is, what is an audit function, and where does that audit happen? And we don't have, that's where the work needs to be done.
That's what the law actually that I was referring to, that's what it will push companies to do, There's anti-discrimination law that prevent against that, but that's not a good. That's actually, I'm writing a paper on that right now. It's not a really good model. It's really because they're at the evidentiary level, as Mita talks about, there's a lack of transparency. It's hard to prove, to make a case. I've been discriminated against because of how the AI has made a decision upon me. So you need both, actually. Like there's the current law that still continues to apply, but I think there needs to be more pressure put on organization using AI. Accountable AI, all the words that we're using, ethical AI, but it's more ethical. It's more than ethical. It's legal AI. There are things that are clearly illegal that you're just not allowed to do. There are a lot of hands raised. Yes, I don't know. Did you? And then there was...
Yeah, more than one speaker has mentioned the idea of users interacting with the model or the tool, and then that information being used to update or change the model. How is that currently being done?
So there's a refinement approach that takes information from your essentially like the conversation that you have with it, and it really partly depends on what the user does with the interaction. So if I say if we'd asked those questions that I had before, and I noticed that there are some things that it's missing in there or that are incorrect, and I say, Chat-GPT, I noticed that this part needs to be fleshed out more. Can you explore that for me? And by the way, that's incorrect. It will literally say to you, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right. You are correct. I gave you something that was not right. But what it's doing in the background is reinforcing the fact that human feedback had told it that this piece was incorrect. So the more detailed your feedback to it is, the better it learns, or the faster it can learn that.
Unless it's learning from someone who doesn't know what they're talking
Exactly. So that's the difference between, say, what Westlaw and LexisNexis have been doing and some of those other smaller startups that are training on specific corpuses of law, where they're using human reinforcement to ensure that the information that goes out is accurate. Once we take off those guardrails, we have to be pretty sure that the model, the foundational model, has at least enough information, or at least enough bias removed from it, that we can be comfortable with it. And this is one of the real challenges, I think, at the moment, because those other models like Chat-GPT now have moved into that self-reinforcement phase, and it could get pretty ugly from here.
Remember, no Australia.
Doesn't exist.
Here? No, here.
Who had the question here?
Hi, I'm Rahul. I'm the new Research Security Coordinator for the Office of Research Partnerships. My question is...
Good luck.
Thank you.
Welcome and good luck.
Thank you. Before I ask my question, I want to just give a little bit of a background of what I used to do, but because that will help me ask the question as well. So I used to work with one of the bigger consultancy firms, and we were working closely with OpenAI and Microsoft. But when we were doing our research, it was mostly on a sandbox environment where we did not have to care about all the ethical, legal reasonings like we have discussed so far. Now, I'm a certified prompt engineer. So you mentioned that somehow it has become a little bit extinct, but it also depends on the use cases as well. I'll not get into that. But when it comes to research security and when it comes to conducting open source due diligence, how legal or how ethical or how EDI proofed do you think the process would be if I am to engage with a generative AI approach?
That's a wonderful question. I don't know, right? So what is the benchmark? The question is, I think at the bare minimum, we would like the benchmark to be legal. But after that, how do you know? And so I don't know. Is there is there going to be a process? So, for example, if you developed code and you wanted to make sure that your code worked in a whole bunch of variety of weird things, you would throw a whole bunch of tests at it. What if the last name has a hyphen in it? What is this sort of thing? Is there a practice by which there could be a test scenario developed? Again, maybe it's a new culture of practice among those who work in the space. How do you find those edge cases? I mean, the one thing about AI is that there's certain words that just like trip it up, and nobody knows why.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think it's a really great question, and I don't know the answer.
I've got a thought on this, and it's just a thought. But one of the challenges that we saw with the early use of AI was that it was bounded to old data and certain parts of the internet that I'd prefer it didn't have access to. But now that most of them have at least live access to the open web, that means that open content, open publishing has a much greater chance of influencing the way that these models develop. So I think we have this weird balance where we may want to, I think it's a great thing to publish openly anyway, but there may be a balance sheet where we really want to improve that, make reliable information available to these tools to counter some of the less reliable information that it has access to, right? If the top search is Australia doesn't exist, there's a problem in the data set that you have access to. And so locking things away behind paywalls and stuff probably doesn't help us as humanity in dealing with this problem. So open access might actually be our savior.
But research security is a very niche field. Not a lot of people are working on it yet. And it was not until 2022 when the Canadian government decided that we need an infrastructure for research security. And how do we surround ourselves? Like, we are also new to research security, and so is everyone else at all the other public institutions. And I honestly don't have a background in law, so how do I tell myself that I'm not going to be the one who is held responsible if something goes wrong?
That's a good question to ask yourself. I think there's many different aspects, and I'm mindful of the time, but I will, there's a newsletter that I'm quite fond of. It's by Vespendar, and she writes Regs to Riches. And she wrote this wonderful newsletter all about the very fairly unregulated space of data brokers. So we have to, the data brokership is very nebulous. It's the way in which public institutions and companies get information from places that they probably shouldn't, and then sort of clean it. So some of it is there's a lot of work to be done, and yes, you shouldn't be holding the responsibility, and there needs to be a lot of work to say, where is this information coming from? And there is a whole industry out there that collects information and resells it, and it's completely unregulated.
We're losing panelists. Actually, Brandon has had to leave for an interview. This is why Brandon was so slick and,
It was for you guys. No.
And we're also losing Nick, who has to go and who had mentioned this. I mean, we could go on for hours. We went quite a bit off script today, too, and in the sense that we just got really, I think, passionate about certain of the issues, and that's all right. There were other things we wanted to cover we didn't have a chance to cover. As I said, there will be other sort of segments, more than segments. A full day will be devoted to this various questions that we've just broached upon today. So I think we'll have to end here, but I think some of us are available to answer questions. For those who want to stick around, I think we still have the room for another 15 minutes. But before that, as our speakers are leaving, I think we should give a good round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you all the speakers here have very, very busy schedules, so really, really appreciate you being able to join. This was, I'm just, my head is spinning. I still have more questions than when I came in today. Yes. And let's check what happened to Sam. Yes. Also.
Is Sam working?
So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So thank you, Nick.